Well, greetings. Welcome back to another edition of the Has Been podcast. It's been a while. It's been a few days, or as the kids like to say, it's been a minute. Probably been more than a minute. It's been a day, a week, maybe a month since we've did one of these things. And Monday, May 11th is the day that we're gonna do it again. A lot of things going on. Well, maybe not a lot of things, but enough things going on to warrant a discussion or my ramblings, however you want to look at it. We'll hit on women's basketball as they try to put together a roster for next season. Men's basketball has been pretty quiet. Still think they're going to add somebody. Just don't know when, who, and all that kind of stuff. Football's in getting ready for summer conditioning mode. But we'll start with Purdue baseball. I mean, they put themselves in a position here late in the year to potentially get a top four seed in the Big Ten tournament. They're still alive for an NCAA tournament berth, even though a lot of things still have to go their way from a data and metric standpoint. But what they've done this year is pretty remarkable, given a lot of the injuries that they've had to deal with. And they sit today, they're tied for fourth in the Big Ten standings, but they would lose the tiebreaker to Oregon. Uh, Oregon beat them 2 out of 3 to start the Big Ten season way back in early March. So they would lose that tiebreaker. USC's in third place. They would lose a tiebreaker with USC because USC swept them earlier this year. They could, and I emphasize the word could, get to as high as second in the Big Ten. Now, Nebraska would have to get swept. USC and Oregon would have to beat up on each other, and they play this weekend. So it's unlikely that they would get to number two. Maybe they could get to number three. I think four is a more realistic option for them. They have to beat Iowa at least 2 out of 3 to close the season out this weekend, starting Thursday. And that series is going to be in Des Moines at the Iowa Cubs stadium. Just kind of one of those things that happened where the Iowa coach Rick Heller and Purdue coach Greg Goff are good friends. Iowa played a series there last year, I think, against Oregon State, and Heller called Goff in the off season, said, "Hey, we want to do it again. You're on the schedule for the end of the year. Do you want to do it?" And didn't take Greg Goff long to say yes. As you looked at the ballpark and get on a neutral site location in a minor league stadium. So they said yes to that, and we'll see how that ends up, how that impacts the series coming up this week. But Purdue needs to get 2 out of 3 just to have a chance to get into the top four. And the top four is important because you avoid the double elimination tournament, the double elimination mini tournament that they have, and they seed everybody, seeded in pods and grouped in pods, where you're automatically in the quarterfinals of the Big Ten tournament if you're in the top four, and you don't have to use any of your pitching until the teams that have beat up on each other get to you. Because if you're in the top four, let's say for example Purdue does get to number four, the first team that they'll play in the Big Ten tournament would have already played 2 games. So in theory, they've used their number one and their number two. So you would be facing their Sunday starter, or their number 3 pitcher, or another pitcher of choice, or a bullpen game, however that other team wants to do it, which would give those teams, those top 4 teams, and if Purdue's one of them, a decided advantage from a pitching standpoint, because Purdue would be able to trot out its number one, its Friday starter, for that first game. So you're at an advantage there. You don't run through your pitching staff as you normally would in a double elimination tournament. So those top 4 teams then have an advantage, as they should. And first year for this format, curious how it plays out. but yeah, the tournament was like would start on May 19th, which is Tuesday, and would go all the way to Sunday, May um, that following Sunday on Memorial Day weekend. So it'd be quite a long tournament, and that's most cases they're playing 4 games a day, and if you don't get any rain, you're in great shape. But if you get some rain, you're not in great shape. So you have to usually have to work through some weather issues with these tournaments. But that's what Purdue baseball is going for. And the series against Indiana, if you're not aware, was really um, something out of a movie when you get right down to it. Um, and this year has kind of been like a movie script for Purdue. They've had some major injuries. They've had guys step up. They've had to have big rallies at the end. Um, and through all that, they just kind of keep winning, uh, keep putting themselves in a position to. You get to the last weekend, and you got a chance to do something that no one thought you could do, and also maybe potentially get in the NCAA tournament. But with the Indiana series, you got to remember Purdue has not swept Indiana in 15 years. Now they haven't played every year, but it's been since 2011 that Purdue has not swept Indiana, and it didn't look like they would sweep Indiana this year. The Friday night game, Purdue's down 8-0. They get it to 8-2, then it gets to 9-2. Um, and then they get to the bottom of the eighth inning, and then they got into their bullpen. One thing happened, one thing led to another. A single here drives into a walk here, another hit. All of a sudden um, they got runners on second and third with a chance to tie the game, and out trots Brandon Rogers. He's a guy that's been hurt. He broke his left hand April 3rd, died or crashing into the wall at Purdue. He was out 35 days. Um, so Greg Goff puts him in there to pinch hit. Um, that Purdue's down 9-7. He gets a single to left, 2 run score, game's tied. Next batter, Sam Flores hits a 2-run homer. Purdue goes on and wins 11-9. I mean, that was pretty remarkable to see. But if you thought that was something, if you're not familiar with the weekend, stay tuned. On Saturday, Purdue was lifeless. They couldn't get anything going offensively. Pitching was okay. Um, they got behind again, 2-0. The thing about this series in the first 2 games, Purdue could not do anything with the IU starters. They couldn't manufacture enough offense against them. It's only when they got to the bullpen did things unravel for IU. But then on Saturday, I mean, they're down 4-0. They're going to the ninth. They're in worse shape than they were the night before, not from a deficit standpoint, but just from an emotional standpoint. I mean, they look like they had nothing to offer. And you credit the other team with their pitching and being able to make the plays, but then in the ninth inning, a single, um, some walks, some other plays, all of a sudden it starts to roll. And again, this guy named Brandon Rogers steps to the plate with the bases loaded, Purdue's down 4-2. And this is where I'm going to uh, criticize the IU coaching staff. Those familiar with baseball strategy late in games, what's the one thing that you prevent? One thing you try to prevent in those situations when you're trying to protect a lead in the eighth or ninth inning? No doubles. Okay. By playing no doubles, it means you're guarding the line as best as you can. Your first and third baseman are tight to the line. And your outfield's lined up to a point where you don't want a ball over your head, you don't want a ball in the gap, you don't want a ball to get out there and roll around and have a bunch of people score. Well, in this case, I use coaching staff for whatever reason has its first baseman. Now, he could have been told get closer to the line. He didn't do it, but he is playing off the line so far like it's the first inning. And Brandon Rogers again steps to the plate He's got a two-strike count. He's 1-2, I believe, and goes back to his fundamentals, two-strike approach. Just take the ball wherever it's placed, and he didn't dribble it down the first base line, but he didn't smoke it either. And the ball just kind of drifted, rolled down the first base line into the right field corner. All three runs score, Purdue stages a 5-run rally, um, and they beat IU 5-4. And by the time the right fielder got the ball, and he was playing over in right center field for some strange reason, um, by the time the right fielder got the ball, the Purdue runner that was on first, he was rounding third, and there was no way that IU was going to be able to gun him down. It's probably one of the most dramatic ninth inning rallies or late inning rallies that I've seen uh, covering sports, maybe forever. In the uh, covered a lot of high school state tournament games that came down to the last inning, and there was some crazy stuff that happened in those games. But in a less than 24-hour period to pull two games out like that, some things are on your side with that. And, it's the same guy doing it. And that's the other thing. I mean, he was scheduled to hit eighth in the order. So you didn't think they would even get to that point, but they did. And then Sunday, it looked like it would be a normal game. Purdue got out to an early lead. Avery Moore kind of set the tone. Had some home run, had 2-run homer in the first. Added another homer later. Had a couple doubles. He was 4 for 4. Purdue was up 5-0. IU got a couple runs, and then all of a sudden IU burst out with a big inning, um, and they took a 7-6 lead going to the bottom of the sixth. And it's like, okay, Purdue's at its best when they're down, and they were down. And once again, the guy named Brandon Rogers gets up to the plate, um, two guys on, and again, IU's defensive alignment is completely mystified. And in this case, maybe the first baseman is a little bit closer to the line. It's a sixth inning, so maybe you're not in no doubles mode at that point. But still, first baseman's probably a little bit closer to the line than he was in the previous games. But the right fielder is like closer to right center field or center field than he is right field, which it baffled me all day why they were playing that way. If you remember, when Dylan Thieneman was a football player for Purdue, a safety, and in Ryan Walters' scheme, he lined up 20 yards off the ball. And I always joke, like, when the other team was going to the north, that Dylan Thieneman was lining up in Benton County. He was so far off the ball. This right fielder was lining up, was settling in Benton County. He was so far out of alignment and so far away from the line that I mean, I get you protect the gaps as much as you can, but what Rogers do? He dumped one into right field. It took forever for the right fielder to even get to the ball, and he's got a triple. He's got a 2-run triple, and Purdue's got the lead. So clearly, Brandon Rogers is the man of the series um, with his clutch hits. And I get to his numbers in a minute, but then Purdue adds 3 runs in the seventh. Um, they're up 11-7. IU gets a run. It's 11-8. Jake Kramer comes in, has a 2-inning save. He's been lights out most of the year, and Purdue sweeps the series, sweeps IU for the first time since 2011. I mean, in 46 hours, I mean, all this happened, and it's crazy. It's a bit wild. You had no idea it would play out like that, and that's why you love sports, and that's why you watch these things to see something you haven't seen before. But with Rogers, he had 4 hits in the series. 3 of them came in the 6th inning or later, and those 3 hits accounted for 7 RBI. They all came with 2 outs. if he's got a clutch gene, which he does, that's it. I mean, he was the man of the hour, the man of the series. There were other guys that hit. I mean, Purdue had 16 hits on Sunday, 9 extra bases. So other guys chipped in. Avery Moore, as I said, was 4 for 4, got on base 5 times. Um, but when Rogers came up to the plate, boom. I mean, he was delivering. If there were guys on base and it was a tight game and it was in the situation warranted to do that, and he delivered. And that's something I don't know, something you can't coach, something you can't teach. It just you have it in you. And he had the other thing about him, he had limited bats coming into the weekend. He faced um, hadn't been at the plate against in a game in 35 days. First time he's up there, he gets a 2-run single to tie the game on Friday, and then gets a few more bats on Saturday, and then a few more bats on Sunday, and then he's delivering in the clutch. And you go back and look, it's like, well, maybe don't have the best player beat you. Maybe you put him on Sunday in that situation where he doesn't triple. But Purdue's got such a deep lineup that once you get to that, you got Brandon Rogers in there, you've got Sam Flores, you've got Avery Moore, you got Jackson Bassett. I mean, you've got guys that um, can beat you with their bat. And that's kind of been Purdue's story this season. They've had multiple guys step up at different times, and that's usually what happens when you're having a year like Purdue's having. You get it from up and down the roster, and they've had to do it because of injuries and some other things, and they've been able to get through all that. But it's a pretty remarkable weekend to watch that unfold. And the other thing with IU, I mean, the manager did not have a good weekend. Um, I don't know if he's responsible for the defensive alignments, but somebody on that staff is. Um, then I heard he was kind of not taking responsibility for the defensive alignments and throwing some of his players under the bus. But on Friday night, um, now in college baseball, you get your coach or your manager can go out there once to talk to the pitcher and all that. But the second time you go out, you got to change. You got to change pitcher unless there's an injury or you're checking on something, but you have to notify the umpire beforehand. Well, it's the seventh or eighth inning on Friday night. He wants to make a pitching change, but he had forgotten that his pitching coach went out earlier in the inning to talk to whoever was on the mound. So when he went out, he thought it was his first trip. And the umpire is like, no, this is your second trip. And then he tried to play it off like, oh, I'm checking his arm. It's like, no, 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 no. You need to notify me beforehand. That's what you're doing. And he didn't do it. So he goes, you got to make a change. Well, the guy in the bullpen wasn't completely warmed up. And one thing led to another. He ends up scoring 7 runs in that inning. So the manager from IU did not have a good weekend, in my opinion. Now, IU's not had a great season. They're not going to make the Big Ten tournament. Um, this is the first time, in more than a decade that they won't make the Big Ten tournament. So he should be fortunate that they have a football coach and program that's winning national championships because no one's really paying attention to baseball down there right now. They're all wrapped up in football, and you can have this kind of year and get through it okay. But anyway, baseball's in a pretty good position right now. As I said, they're going to Des Moines to play Iowa. Need to get 2 out of 3 to stay alive in the Big Ten tournament, and then also probably stay alive for an NCAA bid. That's NCAA bid is going to come down to the very last weekend and all the data, and they crunch everything and what the committee sees and all that. The only thing Purdue can do right now is just win. They can just win games, win as many games as you can. Ideal situation, you sweep Iowa, you get in the Big Ten tournament, you get you're in the top 4. Maybe you win that first game, then you would be matched up with UCLA in the second game in the semifinals. And I mean, UCLA is a juggernaut. Oregon beat them over the weekend. That's their first Big Ten loss. They're 26-1 in the Big Ten, something like that. They've already clinched their regular season title. They're number one team in the country. They're the favorite to win the national championship. You'd rather get to the semifinals and play UCLA and then probably get ousted. Uh, but then you took it as far as you could, and that would not be a bad loss for Purdue, as opposed to coming through those early rounds and not having any pitching to deal with UCLA. That would be really hurtful for Purdue. But at this point, you can only do what you can, and you leave it up to the data. You leave it up to the committee. Maybe they can sneak in there at the very end if you look at how they finish and all that kind of stuff. Um, Now they were supposed to play Tuesday night against Ball State in Muncie, but that game got canceled, not because of the weather. And they were supposed to play Ball State last week. That game did get canceled, in part because of the weather, but also in part because Ball State doesn't have a good RPI. And part of the metric that the baseball committee uses is the RPI. So, and the Ball State coach is the former coach at Michigan. So there's a lot of gamesmanship in college baseball once you get to May and these midweek games. They don't want to play anybody that will hurt their RPI just by showing up. You know, Purdue could play Ball State, could beat them 10-0, but their RPI is not good enough. You're probably going to drop a little bit. So there's an outside chance Purdue could get a game on Tuesday at Alexander Field. Um, One team that was mentioned as a possibility was Miami of Ohio, which they've already played because they have a good RPI. But that would be the only reason Purdue would do it. You're not going to go play a sub RPI team at this late in the year that's going to hurt your own RPI. You're better off not playing. And I think that probably what happened with Purdue. They won't play on Tuesday. They still could get out there, but you're looking at somebody in a driving distance radius that would come here and play. A lot of things have to line up for that to happen. Purdue's probably better off just not playing. And I did see today that the NCAA sent a memo to all the coaches saying, hey, stop with the shenanigans. Stop with the canceling of midweek games, unless it's for weather reasons. And I don't know how they get a handle on that. That's going to be a tough one to monitor and control. Michigan's done it a couple times already this year. I saw where uh, Virginia Tech was supposed to go to Marshall, and they canceled that. So yeah, I don't know how they get a handle on it because there are at times legitimate reasons why you need to cancel a game, but in this case with Purdue and Ball State, it's not. When they send out the release to say game canceled will not be made up, that's your sign saying we don't like your RPI and we're gonna cancel this game. Now, last week when they did it, it did rain. There was some weather involved, but the motivation initially was that we can't play this game because it's going to hurt our RPI. I don't have an answer how you fix this problem, um, other than you start finding schools. I mean, take it where it hurts, the money. So anyway, that's kind of the case with Purdue baseball right now. I know not the most, it doesn't grab a lot of attention, but they've drawn well at Alexander Field. They had close to 2,000 every game this weekend. They've had big crowds during the week, midweek games. They've had big crowds on the weekends, especially Friday nights. I think this community, when they're doing well, they get behind them, and they've had some nice crowds this year at Alexander Field, and I think people are, paying a little bit more attention to baseball, and it'd be nice if they could somehow get themselves into the NCAA tournament and have that shot. But they got a lot of business to take care of before then. Switching to women's basketball, um, uh, the roster right now, as of May 11th, sits at 13 players. There's a lot of chatter that Katie Gearlds wants to get to 15. She wants 15 players on the roster. The portal's closed. You can't get in the portal. The only way you can get in the portal now is through a graduate transfer Could there be a player out there that hasn't technically graduated yet that would become a graduate transfer? Sure. Um, but usually, those players are already spoken for. You have the international route, which they're doing a lot of this year, that you could go get another international player. They've tried. They have six, I believe, international players. Um, but they did try to go get a point guard uh, from overseas, but they couldn't offer enough money. And that's the other factor in this thing is you try to add here late, how much revenue share money do you have available at this point? You have 13 players on your roster. I assume everyone's getting something financially, some more than others, because that's the way the world works. But how much money do you have available to even entice someone to come to your program? Um, they probably had to pay a good salary to the player from UC Riverside, who was the nation's fifth leading scorer, who probably had a lot of interest. They probably had to pay more than what they wanted to, and that's the way business works. You do in the pros, they overpay every day. So they probably overpaid somewhat. And there's been some players they've tried to get that averaged 2 points a game last year, 3 points a game, but you know, six figures wasn't enough for them, or low six figures wasn't enough for them. It's like, okay, but we're in a supply and demand market now. Uh, there's not a lot of players, and there's a demand for a lot of players. So all these players have agents and people that represent them that know how to play the game, and they're taking care of their clients. But that's where we've come to, and we're not going back. This is the system. This is how it's going to work. And the thing that hurts the women's program is they don't have NIL money. And if they do, it's very limited. Like for example, Oklahoma State. I don't know how much you follow, but they have really made a big splash in the portal market this year, where their roster is probably upwards based on reporting that's out there, probably close to $4 million roster. Now, women's basketball programs from a revenue share standpoint, and I've tried to explain this throughout these sessions. You have a bucket of revenue share, which comes from technically your own athletic department. And then you have a bucket of NIL, which is outside third party income. Well, the bucket for revenue share for women's basketball is roughly 5% of, if you're lucky, it's 5% of the salary pool that's available, because you have from the house settlement. Because this past year, schools were working with $20.5 million salary cap, hard cap, couldn't go over it. Well, 75% of that went to football, roughly. 15% roughly went to men's basketball. That leaves 10%, in Purdue's case, women's basketball and volleyball also received revenue share. Now I don't think it was an even, 5% here, 5% there. Um, you know, I would guess that women's basketball got a little bit more than volleyball, but then there's nothing left over after that. Maybe a pool of 200 or $300,000 that the other sports can fight over. So my point is, like, for women's basketball programs, their revenue share is roughly probably in the neighborhood of $1 million, give or take, depending on how much commitment the school is willing to make. So you don't have a lot there um, to shell out. If you don't have third party NIL, you got nothing. And a lot of these schools have third party NIL. Oklahoma State obviously does. The ghost of T. Boone Pickens from the grave, just shelling out money to fill their roster out, a $4 million roster. If you remember, the Kentucky men's basketball team last year had the $22 million roster that nobody disputed. No one actually ever came out and said, yes, we have a $22 million roster, but nobody disputed it. Nobody said, no, that's a lie. We that's not, no, we don't have that. No, they let it go because it's true. It might not have been exactly 22 million, but it was in the neighborhood, and no one said, "Hey, no, that's wrong." No, they kept quiet. They just they just let it go. Um, so when they don't refute it, you got a pretty good idea you're in the neighborhood. Um, but the point with the NIL for the women's team is they just don't have. I think they have some. They just don't have enough that you can go out there. But as I've said before, the issue with the women's program is not, in my opinion, not necessarily money or the lack of money. It's the fact they've had 3 straight losing seasons, and great players want to play with great players. And to be candid and transparent about the program, which is really nothing new, they don't have a great player on their roster right now. They just don't. And they haven't had one for a while. Like a great player that would attract other great players. So you've got to get one great player first, and then maybe other great players follow. But great players want to play with great players. And in Oklahoma State situation, you get one great player, pay him a lot of money. Well, another great player comes along, do the same thing. And then you get there. I have no idea what their team chemistry will be like. I have no idea how the locker room's going to react to all that. What happens when they get on a 3-game losing streak? There's a lot of potential issues with that, but this is what the system is now. And you roll your dice, and the coach there could just be, okay, all in this year. Let's have a great year. Maybe they get to the Final Four. Maybe they win the Big 12. Maybe they make a big splash. Maybe they get ranked in the top 5, all that kind of stuff. And she can parlay that into a higher paying job than what she has now at a power 4 school. Um, that could be that could be her plan. That could be the motivation. Or they have a great year and the school wants to keep her, but they're going to have to pay to keep her. This seems like a 1-year flash, but it doesn't seem sustainable because you got to go out and do it again next year. And if the ghost of T. Boone Pickens is going to bankroll your basketball team, then go for it. There's a lot more rules that need to be enforced, a lot more things that have to happen. How that equates to the Purdue situation is they don't have that third party income to really lure players. But again, I think the issue is more the losing that has gone on here, and not just losing games, but in the Big Ten getting rolled. 40-point losses, 45-point losses, 30-point losses, barely getting into the Big Ten tournament. I think that's more of a hindrance than the money. You can throw a lot of money. I think you could throw a lot of money at a player and say, "Hey, this, you're going to get rich here." But when they look at the roster and say, "Am I going to win? Can I win?" Then the answer probably is no, because there's really nothing on the roster right now that's appealing to you. They have a bunch of new players, but you don't know who they are. You don't. All you see is on paper. What on paper? Yes, the Hannah Wickstrom from UC Riverside averaged 23, 24 points a game last year, ranked 5th in the nation in scoring. But how does that translate to the Big Ten? How does that translate to the non-conference schedule Purdue will play, which won't be strong? And is she physically capable of holding up in the Big Ten against bigger guards? I mean, she's decent size, but is she physically strong enough to withstand uh, the type of games that are played in the Big Ten and hold up and getting guarded one-on-one by bigger, physically stronger players? And how does she hold up in that situation? And then the other players, how do their games from where they've been translate to Purdue, and do they fit Katie's system? There's a whole host of questions here that obviously we're not going to know the answers to for a long time. But that's the other thing. Was this roster put together with a plan in mind, to make it work and make it gel together? On paper, it doesn't appear so. And I still don't know who their point guard is going to be. And when I look at these players that have come in, no one jumps off the page and said, "Oh, there's the point guard," or we got ourselves a point guard. I have a feeling that it's going to be point guard by committee again, or ball handler by committee. You need to have someone running the show. You know, maybe Wickstrom is that player. She seems more of an off the ball type of player because she's a volume shooter. Um, but maybe she handles some of those duties. I mean, they had issues last year because they didn't have a true point guard out there. Madison Layden-Zay, was the point guard uh, for a lot of the season until she got hurt. Taylor Feldman only played in 7 games. She showed flashes, but decided she didn't want to be here. So you're kind of back to the same point you were last year during the season. Now, before the year, you thought you'd have Feldman as your point guard, and things would go from there. But as you got in the middle of the year, you found out you didn't have a point guard, and I think that's kind of where this team is at right now. You know, I'm sure in their mind they have this handful of players they look at as a point guard, and they'll go from there. But on paper, it doesn't appear they have one right now. And if you go through this off season and you don't get a true point guard, and if you get one now, you're really at the bottom of the transfer portal. What kind of impact would that player be? I hope that she doesn't add 2 more players, unless there's a 5-star out there that hasn't decided where they're going. Because I just don't, having 15 players that you got to pay and then you got to figure out a way to play. You have people sitting on your bench that are making money that are not going to play. And are you going to bring someone in just to be a practice player? That's why you have the managers. That's why you have the guys. That's why you have your male practice squad. I'd rather pay them than bring in another player that you got to figure out how to get minutes for. Um, anyway, it doesn't. Again, there's a lot to sort through as we get through the off season and all that to see where this ends up. The other question is Purdue really better? Are they going to be better than they were at the end of last year? It's hard to say yes right now because there's too many unknowns. Other teams in their neighborhood at the bottom of the Big Ten have made improvements. Either they've changed coaches or they've added more talent on paper. Wisconsin, for example. Um, they didn't change coaches, but they've added more talent based on uh, based on paper to give the indication that they have improved. They added a 5-star player out of high school, Addie Deal, who went to Iowa, didn't play a whole lot, struggled a little bit, didn't never got really good, never got comfortable in the system, and she decided to transfer, and she ends up at Wisconsin. I'm sure that Wisconsin took care of her financially, and but if she plays at a 4-star level for Wisconsin, that'll be huge for them. And they got another player from a mid-major that a big center that should help them. Look at Northwestern; they changed coaches, so they've improved just based on that alone. Penn State changed coaches. I'm not sure they've improved. I'm not sure that's going to push them out of the basement of the Big Ten. Rutgers changed coaches. They got an assistant from LSU, Gary Redis, great recruiter, but how does he handle the dynamics of the locker room? How does he handle um, all those things that come with being a head coach? They'll be more talented. They'll have more talent on their team, but how does he bring that all together? But Purdue, I would say right now, hasn't really moved the needle a whole lot from an improvement standpoint. And there's not a ton of confidence that this coaching staff can bring that all together and make it work, because it's been tried the last couple of years by going into the portal, bringing in a bunch of new players, trying to make it work, And you always think, well, the next time it'll work. So there's not a foundation of, oh, this is how they do things. This is it. There's still no identity with this program. There's still no clear indication of who they are, who they want to be. Um, and roster construction and roster management is now such a huge deal uh, in all of college sports, not just basketball, that they've got to, figure that part out. But maybe we'll be pleasantly surprised. Um, maybe it'll all come together. Um, and they did their homework, and they scouted well. They got players that fit what they want to do and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, maybe that all works, and you should be optimistic that it will work. But as of right now, what I see on paper doesn't seem to mesh together uh, as well as it will need to. But you can say the same thing about Oklahoma State. They've just brought in a bunch of really good players, a bunch of talented players, but how do they work together? How does it mesh together? What's the plan for them? And that's either going to go one way or the other. It's either going to be great, they're going to be the story of women's college basketball, or it's going to implode and they're going to struggle and they're going to be mocked and they're going to say, well, here's why you don't do what they did, type of thing. I don't think there's a middle ground there for Oklahoma State. Finishing 500, I don't see them. I don't see them doing that. They should be good enough to be in contention for their conference title and winning a bunch of games and getting a good spot in the NCAA tournament and making a run. But injuries happen, other things happen. You get in there, and well, this is not what I thought it'd be, and things go off the rails. See it all the time, but at the end of the day, the players are getting paid. It doesn't really matter after that. I do know some of the players that left Purdue while they got paid at Purdue and they got paid at their new school. Winning was important to them, and they didn't feel like winning was going to happen at Purdue. I do think winning matters for a lot of these players, especially your high level players. Um, but when you're not winning, you're viewed as just getting a paycheck and moving on. Um, so we'll see what happens. Got to see the non-conference schedule, see how that plays out. We know who they're going to play in the Big Ten, and we know where they're going to play, just don't know when. So I think they're in a tournament in Thanksgiving at Orlando. Don't know the other teams there, but knowing how this program has scheduled the last couple of years, I wouldn't expect uh, high profile opponents in there if they can swing it. They may not be able to. They may have to end up playing some some power four opponents that you really didn't want to, and are not ready to play. But then again, you reserve full judgment until you get a chance to see the team together and see how it operates and see how it's going to work. So that should be the story is, you just kind of have, in this day and age, you just kind of have to wait and see how it all comes together, and and how it looks once they get on the court. Um, yeah, really nothing else at top of mind here. Some college football stuff happening. They're trying to get a 2014 playoff going, uh, which I'm okay with. I mean, if that's where it's going to end up, then just get there. Let's not go to 16 or 20. Just get to 24, and that would eliminate championship games. Start your playoff around Thanksgiving. You got to get it done. They want to get it done by early January, but um, and how they get it done will determine based on TV, um, because college football will not want to go up against the NFL, and the NFL is such a mean group of people that they'll probably schedule playoff games around the college football playoff game or on the same date that they want to play because they can and they will, and they want to rule the world. and college football has no choice but to get off that date, because ESPN won't want to do anything on that date. Uh, they would prefer to have the NFL playoff when you get right down to it. So there's some movement there. I hope it gets settled sooner than later. Congress is still trying to get involved with college athletics. Leave it alone. Come on. I mean, you got other things to worry about. Um, Instead of trying to put a cap on coaches' salaries and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's a free market enterprise here. Coaches get what they want. Players now get what they want. Uh, so it's both. Everybody's getting what they want. It's not great for the sport. It's not great for the whole enterprise, but you know, this is where we are, and they're going to keep doing things to move it forward. But anyway, I do hope that we get to a college football playoff system that is where we're going to be for a while. I think that's important instead of expanding here and there, doing different things. Just get to 24, let it go. How Purdue would fit into that equation. There would be more opportunities to maybe sneak in the playoff. But you got to have a really good year. Even with 24 teams, you got to have a really good year to get in that mix. As I said, the championship games would go away. They would like for it to get over early January, have the championship game there. But in that way, they can base their calendar and when the portal opens and all that kind of stuff around that playoff, because you don't want the portal open during your playoff end of the day. And then the NCAA basketball tournament expanded 76 teams, which I think is a horrible idea, especially for the women's game. There's just not enough depth in the sport to warrant adding more teams. 68 was a stretch. 64 was a stretch back in 1994. 68 was a stretch. And now you're adding 8 more at-large teams that have not earned their way into the field. It just, but the president of the NCAA wanted to do it. He was getting pressure from the commissioners of the SEC and the Big Ten to do this because the coaches that were 7-11 or 7-13 in the SEC or the Big Ten, getting pressure because they're not making the tournament. Well, if you make the tournament, you got to you have to advance. Making the tournament is no longer just okay. You got to advance now. You just do. If you make the tournament, get beat 2 years in a row in the first round or whatever they're going to call it, why should we keep you? Be careful what you wish for. And that's kind of what's happening here. It's a watered down event now. Uh, they'll do some things to still make Thursday at noon the official start of the tournament, but you're going to have, I don't know how many games they're going to have, but on Tuesday and Wednesday to get this thing off and running and sites across the country. The one thing that hadn't been talked about a lot, because it was talked about last year during the tournament, it's just the lack of charter planes. There's a low supply of charter planes out there, and you're going to try to move these teams across the country at the last minute. Not only men's teams, but women's teams, going everywhere. Teams got to get home. Teams got to get to a location. Teams got to get home. I mean, it's already a stretched environment, and more teams will probably have to bus. They'll probably expand their mile radius. Purdue technically, I think last year was required to bus to St. Louis, but out of their pocket they did charter. And if the NCAA gives you that option, schools like Purdue will pick the charter every time. But I think Purdue paid for the charter. I don't think it came out of any reimbursement. So schools are going to do what they need to do, but they'll probably be a lot of schools will be forced to bus farther distances because there's just not enough planes out there to make this all work. And then you're adding more games to fans that want to travel to see their teams. It was a system that wasn't broke. and all of a sudden it's broken, in my opinion. People still watch, people still cheer. Um, and once you get to as I said, once you get to Thursday at noon, when the real tournament starts, I think when the excitement will kick in. But how do you get excited about an 11 beating an 11 Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock? I don't know. I don't know if you can or not. And that's the other thing is the whole bracket thing that people have embraced. How do the people that run the brackets deal with the extra teams now? They just ignore them, or how do you do that? And how do you make it fair? How do you make sure everybody's got a fair shot in that? When you're dealing with money and things like that. But anyway, those are some of the things that have happened, um, and that's kind of it for now. Anyway, appreciate you stopping by. Um, have a good day, and make sure I can turn this thing off. Anyway, appreciate you stopping by, and we'll do this again when we have some new information, some new things to talk about. Um, maybe that'll be next week after um, baseball. We figure out what baseball's doing and see if the women have added any more players and if the men add a player here coming up. Anyway, thanks again. Thanks for stopping by. Have a good day, and we'll talk to you later.